Thank you for being a part of this encore version of a live presentation made at the University of Mississippi on February 27th, 2024. I'm Kirk Johnson, professor of sociology and African American studies at the university. And I'd like to thank Dr. Kirsten Dellinger, Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the university, and Ms. Val Ross, Program Manager for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, for organizing the Ideas Forum for which this presentation was made. It was Ms. Ross who thought of the idea of revisiting the Eyes on the Prize documentary and updating it for 2024. So I'm grateful for her inspiration. I have a number of slides that I'll include in this presentation, and just as a word of warning, some of them may be disturbing. For anyone who is unfamiliar with the documentary, Eyes was a 14-part TV series made by a small Black-owned film production company in Boston and broadcast for the first time in 1987. As it continued to air during Black History Month, for many years, the series became a bit of a cultural phenomenon, with companion materials and videos found in schools and libraries across the country. Eyes was the vision of Henry Hampton, who was marching with Dr. King in Selma in 1965 and realized he was in the middle of a great story that needed to be captured on film. 20 years and a lot of fundraising later, Henry and a group of young filmmakers began production on the first season of Eyes. It was 6 programs covering the years 1954 to 1965. I was the senior researcher for Series 2, the last 8 programs, which covered 1965 to 1985. The series is broadcast by PBS to an estimated 20 million viewers. One reason the audience was so large had to do with the production team. It wasn't just the individual talents of the filmmakers, but also how Henry composed the teams. The producers had an immense challenge: how to condense 30 years of history into just 14 hours of screen time. Each hour was long enough to tell only 2 stories, so they had to select the 28 most important civil rights stories in 3 pivotal decades. They got help from academic advisors as well as former activists and civil rights leaders who met with the producers for a 3-day crash course on civil rights history. But then it was up to the producers to decide what stories to tell and how to tell them. To get maximum audience buy-in, Henry paired a white male producer with a Black female producer, or a white female with a Black male. Here's how the production staff looked after an all-day meeting to talk about program content. There's Henry on the bottom circled, and I'm standing way over to Henry's right underneath the staircase. I can tell you there are plenty of disagreements in this process because people don't necessarily have the same perspectives on how any given event should be portrayed, or even whether it's important. But for the best outcome, people had to hash out these differences. And Henry realized that there are less likely to be differences to even hash out when everybody in the room looks the same. In the end, let me show you what the teams came up with. The first season begins with the murder of Emmett Till. 2 integration stories. The March on Washington. Mississippi figures prominently in the first series. This first event probably more infamous and well-known than the second, but both of them quite important. And that's the end of season 1. Season 2 begins with the emergence of Malcolm X. The movement moves north. Dr. King assassinated. Cassius Clay becomes Muhammad Ali. Backlash by police and law enforcement. More backlash against the movement. want to give you a taste of what the series looked like. It was a combination of archival footage and interviews with eyewitnesses that really made up this series. Here are the first few minutes of the first season's first story. It's a 3 or so minute introduction to what the series was all about.
Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
I guess our courage came out because we didn't have nothing, that we couldn't lose nothing. But we wanted something for ourselves and for our children. And so we took a chance with our lives.
We marched up the steps with this circle of soldiers with bayonets drawn. And walking up the steps that day was probably one of the biggest feelings I've ever had. I figured I had finally cracked it.
My freedom is very much entangled with the freedom of every other man. So I'm fighting for my own freedom here.
Are you scared?
Yes, I'm very much afraid. Everyone here is.
In a 10-year period, in the 1950s and 1960s, America fought a second revolution. It was fought in the South by Black people and white. It was fought in the streets, in churches, in courts, in schools. It was fought to make America be America for all its citizens. These were America's civil rights years.
That you are advocating Negroes in New York to stay out of these national chain stories?
Oh, no, that's not true. I'm advocating that American citizens interested in democracy should stay out of change stories.
I have thought for a long time that Negroes should be allowed to sit at the counters where we are served downtown. This is just a part of many things that I think they should be allowed to do.
All the people of the South are in favor of segregation. And Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, we are going to maintain segregated schools down in Dixie.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people.
Get out in front of the camera and go on.
It doesn't matter if you're in front of the camera, you're never facing your shirt. Your clothes.
There was a clear engagement between those who wished the fullness of their personalities to be met and those that would destroy us physically and psychologically. You do not walk away from that. This is what movement meant. Movement meant that finally we were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale. You do not walk away from that. You continue to answer it.
Always think so. But Matthew Jr. told me. And when he called from the jail, he said, "Be cool, mother." And that was very trying, and yet it was amusing too. He's telling me to be cool at this point.
We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. That will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man.
It was a hard fight, challenging America's basic beliefs. What is an inalienable right? What is equal treatment under the law? What is liberty and justice for all? It was a hard fight, but the prize was freedom, and no American could afford to lose.
I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Your eyes on the
This series was very well received across the political spectrum. Time magazine, uh, on the left, said the series was intelligent and graceful, about as good as TV documentaries get. The right-leaning New York Post called it a fabulous work of history, sociology, and humanity. And the series won 21 major film awards, including 6 Emmys and even an Oscar nomination. But the series ended in the mid-'80s. And the question is, if we were to do it again, how might it look? What if those same producers got together to update the nation's racial history since then? In staff meetings, Henry was always slow to say that a given event should or shouldn't be in the series. And that was especially true of recent events. He would always say it's too soon to know whether this or that is historically significant. But I think some events we've seen only recently would probably qualify as historically important in the broad movement for racial equity and social justice. So I'd like to share with you my short list of 4 programs, each containing 2 stories plus a concluding thought. And I offer these as a sociologist with no formal training in history, and as an African-American male whose perspectives may or may not be universal. The first program would be about Voices Unchained. The second, Keeping Hope Alive. Whose Lives Matter? And Conservatives Draw the Line. Let's talk about Voices Unchanged. This is a program about rap music and the Me Too movement. Rap music has been around since the late 1970s, but by the late 1980s, the genre had moved toward gangster rap, a male-dominated sound featuring misogynistic lyrics that glamorized violence and drive-by shootings and drug dealing. Black women like MC Lyte, Queen Latifah, Da Brat, and later artists like Lauryn Hill, Lil' Kim, Missy Elliott, and Nicki Minaj challenged that sensibility. And they did it by demanding respect, holding men accountable, emphasizing financial self-sufficiency, celebrating their sexuality, and calling for female self-determination. But women revolutionized more than the music. They also redefined hip-hop fashion, gradually moving from dressing like the guys to wearing soft fabrics and muted pastels to a hyper-feminine emphasis on dazzling colors, fanciful fabrics, and sometimes outlandish artistry. Women have redefined hip-hop sensibility so much that Angela Tate of the National Museum of African American History and Culture says there would be no hip-hop without women. Yet the dominant faces of rap music and hip-hop culture have been male. It's the angry, defiant Black man that has defined rap, even as some of the most creative and revolutionary practitioners have been women. And here you can see a kind of a pastiche of rappers over the years, and only a few female faces. The same here. Let's fast forward to Me Too. This is a story that begins in 2017, when awareness of sexual violence took center stage with accusations that Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein had sexually assaulted a number of aspiring models and actors. Shortly thereafter, the Me Too movement went viral after actor Alyssa Milano urged victims of sexual harassment to share their stories on social media. Millions of women took to Facebook and Twitter to do just that, giving the impression that Me Too is all about prominent white men and their largely white victims. But the actual founder of the Me Too movement is a Black woman, Tarana Burke. Ms. Burke was sexually assaulted as she was growing up in the Bronx. As an adult, she found herself talking with a 13-year-old girl who confided that she had been sexually assaulted. In the moment, Burke was speechless, and later she felt remorse that she couldn't respond with even the simple words, Me Too. She went on to start the movement shortly thereafter. This practice of overlooking Black women's contributions to social movements is not new. In the 1960s, cameras focused on the male leaders of the civil rights movement, even though much of the day-to-day work was done by Black women. Historian Charles Payne wrote that during his fieldwork in Greenwood, Mississippi, he found that women between the ages of 30 and 50 were 3 times more likely to participate in the movement than men the same age. The message here is that not every voice that's unchained is remembered. Whether we're talking about rap music or Me Too or civil rights, it's a reminder that people who start social movements or sustain them don't always get recognized for their work, which is usually innovative, often difficult, and sometimes dangerous. Let's talk about the Obama presidency. On January 20th, 2009, Americans woke up to something they had never seen before: a Black man sitting behind the desk in the Oval Office. It was a monumental accomplishment. That day was followed by 8 years of transformational achievements that no doubt would have made Dr. King proud. President Obama supported same-sex marriage and prohibited federal contractors from discriminating against LGBTQ employees. Under the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, he allowed immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children to have renewable 2-year periods of freedom from deportation, even if they were brought here illegally. And with his signature achievement, he did what 5 presidents before him had tried to do: democratize health insurance by signing into law the Affordable Care Act. But there were storm clouds over the Obama presidency, and they appeared early on, just weeks after his inauguration. Protesters sprang up all over the country, saying they represented the Tea Party for people who felt they had been taxed enough already. Their call for anti-tax, small government, fiscal conservatism was soon joined by Southerners whose depictions of the new president and his family were reminiscent of the worst antebellum caricatures. But even more ominous for the president's agenda, a group of very powerful GOP senators had already met behind the scenes at this Washington steakhouse on the very night of Obama's inauguration to strategize about how to stop a young, charismatic president whom they had just seen draw 1.5 million enthusiastic supporters to his inauguration. They decided to put in motion the potential equivalent, or the political equivalent, of a full court press. That is to say, oppose everything. As one New York Times reporter put it, unyielding opposition to every Obama initiative. And yet this 2-term president and his team were savvy enough to find enough workarounds to still come out on top. A 2021 survey of presidential historians ranked him number 10 among our 44 presidents for his ability to persuade the public, lead us in crisis, manage the economy, which was in free fall when he came into office, and so forth. That puts Obama above Bill Clinton, LBJ, Jimmy Carter, both Bushes, and 2 of the 4 founding fathers who were also presidents, James Madison and John Adams. People who felt that the Obama election meant racism was over were naive, yet there's no doubt that something had changed since the start of the movement. In the early 1960s, a national survey asked the question, would you be willing to vote for a qualified Negro candidate for public office? And a majority of respondents said no. That's an interesting response when you think of the wording of the question. Most people said they wouldn't vote for a qualified Black candidate, suggesting the only reason they would vote against him was his race. Fast forward to 2009, and we have an African-American in the White House. The message here is that change is possible, but it's fragile because it can be undermined. It takes constant energy, constant diligence, constant shoring up to make it work. I think the Obama presidency is a reminder of that. Let's talk about police killings and their aftermath. In 2014, Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old Black man, was killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. People in Ferguson and all over the world were outraged, and they took to the streets. A few years later, in 2020, a white police officer in Minneapolis kills George Floyd by kneeling on his neck during an arrest. Again, angry protesters fill the streets. People like these Washington, D.C. protesters who joined the Black Lives Matter movement realized that these two deaths were part of a larger trend. The Washington Post estimates that police officers are involved in about 1,000 fatal shootings a year. In one recent year, about 25% involved African-American victims. That's twice as high as a 13% African-American presence in the general population. And of the unarmed men who were fatally shot by police, 40% were African-Americans, whereas African-American men are only 6% of the general population. As it turns out, the police have a long history of violence, much of it directed toward racial and ethnic minorities. Here's a photo from Boston, which organized the first police department in the US in 1836. It shows officers on a police truck, and yes, that is a machine gun on the back. Harvard historian Jill Lepore says the main reason we have a massive police presence in this country is slavery. Before the Civil War, pro-slavery politicians called on the police to silence abolitionists and to enforce so-called slave law, which governed the movement of slaves in this country. After the war, the police were called to enforce Jim Crow laws. But how much of today's police violence can we blame on white racism? After all, before the 1960s, separate and unequal treatment for African Americans was the law, and police are in the business of law enforcement. So treating African Americans differently didn't necessarily mean you felt animosity toward African Americans. It could mean you were just doing your job. You were enforcing racist laws. And look at some of the recent deaths of African American men at the hands of African American police officers. In 2017, Freddie Gray broke his neck in Baltimore after riding shackled and without a seatbelt in a Baltimore police van during what some suspected was a deliberate rough ride that was intended to intimidate prisoners. Of the 6 officers charged in his death, 3 were Black. And just last year, 5 Memphis police officers stopped FedEx worker Tyree Nichols on the road, pulled him out of his car, and fatally beat him in a case for which even the police chief said there was no probable cause. All 5 officers were Black. Clearly, every police department has a culture, and that culture shapes officers' behavior regardless of their race. So the solution to our policing crisis is not just hiring more Black police officers. It probably needs to include ways to challenge cultural norms, especially at departments where police misconduct has been a problem. Protest is healthy and good, but when we call for change, we have to make sure we're asking for something that will actually help us. We need police departments, so let's not defund them. But don't hire more officers of color, assuming they're the answer to police violence. The problem could be larger than that. Protest is healthy, but be sure to ask for the right solution. And let's remember that lesson because we'll come back to it in a moment. Let's talk for a second about the role of conservatives in contemporary politics. If you think about the protesters in season 1 and season 2 of Eyes, you remember it's mostly African Americans, along with their white allies, most of whom are pretty young, oftentimes students. But now in 2020, we see a whole new demographic, middle-aged white people, and they're using protest tactics that they might have dismissed when younger people did it in the 1960s. What these protesters are objecting to is the teaching of critical race theory, or CRT. Many white Americans are also objecting to diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives. But in both cases, I would suggest that if you move beyond the rhetoric, the criticism is based more on emotion than logic. I'm putting up a timeline here so we can take a step back and see how we got here, starting with critical race theory. This is a story that begins in 1970 when a man called the grandfather of CRT, Harvard Law professor Derek Bell, challenges the constitutional promise of liberty and justice for all. He does that in his book, Race, Racism, and American Law, in which he presents 700 pages of legal cases that not only suggests that the law isn't colorblind, but that racial inequality is baked into our legal structure. The book becomes a classic text, required reading still today in law schools across the country. Other scholars quietly add to Professor Bell's work over the years. Their efforts are hardly noticed outside of academia. Then in 2020, a former president calls CRT un-American propaganda and stops federal agencies from educating their employees about race. He says telling them white people benefit from racism only engenders, quote, division and resentment. 2 years later, emboldened by this presidential rhetoric, legislatures in red states like Oklahoma and Texas begin to pressure public school teachers not to teach, quote, divisive concepts like CRT. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis makes national headlines by signing legislation that forbids making anyone feel, quote, discomfort, guilt, or any form of psychological distress in discussions about race, ethnicity, or sexuality in public schools. His appointees ban history textbooks and even certain math textbooks. He follows that by signing a bill stopping teachers from teaching about sexuality and forbidding people from mentioning their sexual orientation in school, the so-called Don't Say Gay law. Now, it's important to understand that these public officials are severely mischaracterizing CRT. This is a theory that doesn't teach divisiveness at all, as much as it illuminates legal inequality under the law. Second, CRT as a topic in higher education. It isn't even taught in primary and secondary schools, so it doesn't make much sense to ban conversations about it. And finally, what is taught in these schools is nothing but American history. And as uncomfortable as learning about the history may make some people, it can cause more psychological distress than what Black folks felt under slavery and Jim Crow, or Hispanics felt when they were mass deported in the 20s and 30s, or how Japanese Americans felt when they were sent to internment camps out west during World War II, or how LGBTQ people felt when they were the target of anti-sodomy laws and police brutality. But angry white parents, no doubt encouraged by these conservative governors and legislators, have pushed on, eventually shifting their attention from what's taught to what's read. This has resulted in book bans, which have now restricted access by 2 million school children to books that mention race or that feature LGBTQ characters. There have been counter-protests like these. People have realized the gravity of miseducating a generation of school children, or not educating them at all, about topics as important as race, ethnicity, sexuality, racism, sexual orientation, homophobia, etc. Teachers have been especially alarmed. In Florida, Iowa, and elsewhere, teachers are resigning rather than stop teaching about race and sexuality. Sometimes teachers have really borne the brunt of this pressure from legislators. This is a Tennessee teacher who was fired for teaching about white privilege. This is a Florida art teacher whose middle school students asked her about her sexuality. When she said she was attracted to both men and women, she was fired as well. I would suggest that none of this is a rational critique of CRT. The problem with criticizing the theory is that the critics are making the theory the target. Perhaps what they should be targeting instead is history books, because for years these books have sanitized the telling of American history. They've reduced racism to a footnote in our distant past, instead of explaining that for the past 300 years, the distinctions that we make based on skin color have been ongoing factors in the creation of great prosperity for some Americans and deprivation and poverty for many others. One of my students listened to the story of how skin color was meaningless in colonial America until racial distinctions were actually invented. They were invented around 1675 as a way of preventing white and Black working people from combining forces to threaten wealthy political elites. This happened in Virginia. And when this student, a young white woman, learned the truth that race is an artificial marker of difference that has no biological significance, it has significance that we give it socially, but in no other way. There's no scientific difference between the ability of white and Black people to do things, she was furious. She raised her hand and she asked me, why were we never taught this? I think critics of CRT should ask the same question. Don't criticize the theory, criticize the false narratives that we've all been taught, that people are wealthy because they worked hard, that anybody can succeed if they really want to, that slavery was a benevolent institution, etc. This is a Harvard historian who studied 3,000 American history books and found a recurring theme of white supremacy. One textbook actually began with the words, "This is the white man's history." What's missing was anything more than a passing mention of racial dominance, racial exclusion, racial terrorism, the mechanisms white people have employed to achieve wealth and power over those 3 centuries, and how generations of people of color have responded. There's similar tension between conservative protesters and liberal counter-protesters with DEI initiatives. These efforts, designed to open businesses and academia to women, people of color, and other minority groups, have been around for decades. Affirmative action is a good example. DEI became part of the national conversation after George Floyd's death was followed by protests in 60 countries around the world. That prompted American businesses to commit to making their workplaces more inclusive. They pledged to hire more employees of color, to invest in HBCUs, to support Black-owned businesses. In the space of 1 year, the nation's largest corporations had pledged nearly $50 billion to fight racial injustice. Here's a statement from Apple, which pledged to strengthen the pipeline of engineers from HBCUs into Apple. And here's the CEO of the financial firm, JP Morgan Chase, taking a knee with the staff of one of his branch banks in sympathy with protesters a week after George Floyd died. But 2 years later, corporate America hadn't made much progress. Apple had hired 3 chief diversity officers who came and left in just 4 years, and some companies had scaled back their diversity programs after threats of lawsuits from shareholders. One such company, JP Morgan Chase. But even when companies conduct mandatory DEI training for their employees, the results are often less than stellar. 2 sociologists, Frank Dobbin from Harvard and Alexandra Kala from Tel Aviv University, think they know why. Their review of the literature shows that anti-bias training can backfire for a number of reasons. First, managers typically resent being told what to do. White males in particular don't like the suggestion that they're racist or sexist, and younger white males who lack seniority may be fearful of losing their job if their company diversifies. Even when people are receptive, their attitudes don't necessarily translate into behavior. Training may make people aware of their biases, but that's usually not enough to stop a lifetime of discriminatory behavior. All these factors could cause employees to resist DEI initiatives. Closer to home, DEI has been under attack in academia as well. Mississippi is one of 9 states to have passed an anti-DEI law. Oklahoma's governor signed an executive order just a few weeks ago at the end of December that eliminates state funding for DEI efforts, including at the state's 55 public colleges. He said it was defunding discrimination, apparently suggesting that supporting underrepresented groups was akin to discriminating against white people. Let's talk about why this response to DEI is more emotional than rational. And at the risk of getting a little personal, I want to close by inviting you to think about our own university. With DEI, I want to suggest that it's not just the critics are aiming at the wrong target, like with CRT. It's that by going after DEI, they're actually working against their own interests. The best way to explain this is to ask you to think about affirmative action. This is an example of an affirmative action policy taken from one of our own bulletin boards on campus. It defines affirmative action as actions designed to prevent discrimination against students and employees regarding recruitment, employment, and participation in programs. It sounds pretty benign if you ask me, but affirmative action has aroused a lot of opposition from people who feel it's an undeserved windfall for underrepresented groups. The truth is, some of the staunchest opponents of affirmative action probably don't realize that they are the biggest beneficiaries of preferential treatment. For example, sometimes white students feel victimized when college admissions offices use affirmative action to acknowledge an applicant's race and ethnicity, but those same white students benefit greatly from their family wealth and connection. In fact, the Educational Testing Service, this is the organization that produces the ACT and other standardized tests, found that the nation's most elite schools give a nod to white applicants, and they get favorable treatment because of their family's wealth and connections. Those students outnumber the African American and Hispanic beneficiaries of affirmative action by a factor of 2 to 1. There's also a widespread feeling that being a member of a minority group, especially an Asian group, is a huge leg up when it comes to getting into college. But a study by 2 Princeton sociologists found that white students are 3 times more likely to be admitted to elite colleges and universities compared to Asian students with the same grades and the same test scores. It's the same situation in the workplace. White women have been some of the harshest critics of affirmative action over the years. 70% of the white women in one study said they somewhat or strongly oppose it. And yet, Michelle Goodwin at Georgetown University Law School is not the only scholar who notes that white women have made historic gains in the workplace in recent years, and affirmative action is no doubt one of the reasons. This is a graph of managers in American workplaces. It's broken down by sex, race, and ethnicity. And you can see here, white women are doing pretty well for themselves. That's been the case since 1971. Similarly, this is a graph of new CEOs coming into the workplace. And you can see here, white women lead the pack. So it's possible to dislike a system without realizing that you benefit from that system. And I suspect the same thing that's going on with affirmative action could be happening with DEI. For example, some people may think that diversifying a campus means making it weaker because we're admitting underprepared students or hiring unqualified instructors. In fact, DEI makes organizations more profitable. These are data from an internationally renowned management consulting firm, McKinsey & Company, recognized as one of the top 3 consulting firms in the world. This is a firm that since 2015 has studied hundreds of large companies in 15 countries. And they found that companies that were the most ethnically diverse outperformed companies that were less diverse by 39%. In other words, companies with lots of black and brown faces were nearly 40% more profitable than mostly white companies. That's also the true with women. Companies with the most gender diverse executive teams last year outperformed male-dominated teams by the same margin. Having women on the team made these companies 39% more profitable than male-dominated spaces. When you bring diverse voices to the table, it makes your organization stronger, not weaker. So Justice Henry Hampton found that diversifying his staff led to a better product. This may be true across the board. In higher ed, we might find that DEI helps our bottom line. This research on the organizational effects of diversity tells us that more diverse faculty, administrators, and students could make us as a university more competitive with better ideas, better research, better teaching, better trained students, and more money. And I don't think sociology, anthropology, and African American studies are the only departments on campus that could use more research dollars or faculty lines. Let me emphasize that last point. DEI isn't just a feel-good strategy. Diversifying this campus could make us wealthier in every sense of the word. Think of how much money we lose when talented scholars decide not to apply to our university because of our reputation, or when we do hire underrepresented scholars and they leave after a few years because the atmosphere is stifling or unwelcoming to underrepresented groups. Diversity can also decrease the anxiety that we feel about difference. We live in a polarized nation. Politically, socially, residentially, opposing camps are far apart. But if we never have any actual contact with the other side, it's easy to believe stereotypes about them. As Mark Twain said, travel is the enemy of prejudice, meaning that people are less likely to buy into prejudicial assumptions about people if they've met them and actually spent time with them. If we want to be better people, as I do, one benefit of a diverse campus is the opportunity to challenge our prejudices with firsthand experiences, thus decreasing anxiety surrounding differentness. And finally, I'd like to suggest that diversity can help us see our own privilege. If you don't have privilege, it's hard not to see the privilege other people have. But when you have privilege, you tend not to see it at all. As I often tell my students, fish don't realize water is wet because they're always immersed in water. Bringing people with privilege in proximity to those with less of it may help advantaged people recognize the power they often take for granted. So here the lesson is opposite of what we learned in the previous segment on policing. In that episode, the take-home lesson was when you protest, be sure you're asking for the right thing. Here with DEI, the lesson seems to be don't dismiss a social justice idea just because it sounds bad. Do your homework, move beyond the hype, and look at the evidence. These ideas help all of us, including their detractors. So those are my picks for the top 4 segments that I would add to EYES if we were updating it. I'd be interested to hear your comments on these or maybe other stories that you think would be great additions to the series. If you'd like, you can email me at kjohnson@olemiss.edu, and I'd be happy to hear from you. And special thanks to some people who read this presentation text and made some comments on it. And for those of you who may be interested in looking at the series, the University Library does have a subscription. And this is a long URL, but if you copy it and then click on it, log in with your web ID and your password, you can see access to all 14 of the original Eyes on the Prize episodes. Thank you for joining us.